Talofa and welcome to PEP Talk, the podcast brought to you by Pacific Enterprise People. I'm your host, Marie Young. PEP Talk brings you alongside some of the Pacific enterprising pioneers of contemporary culture and commerce in the 21st century. Some names you would have heard of and some names you need to hear of. This podcast is about elevating, celebrating, and sharing our authentic narratives through the treasures we reap from life's challenges. I'm really excited that you're listening today. It's an honor. My special guest today hails from the village of Nayavuira in Ra, Fiji, and Sydney, Australia, where he is the first Pacific professor ever at the University of Sydney. His name is Professor Jioji Ravulo, and we are excited to have him on the show today. Professor Jioji is the Professor and Chair of Social Work and Policy Studies in the Sydney School of Education and Social Work at the University of Sydney. His research and areas of interest include mental health and well-being, alcohol and other drugs, youth development, marginality, and decoloniality. He is passionate about creating and implementing social work, educational, and research approaches that are engaging and engage. Nuanced with a genuine commitment to the dynamic inclusion of cultural diversity and its differences, Professor Jioji is super keen to create collaborative spaces for students, community groups, and industry partners. He is involved in various community-based research and co-design initiatives, including projects that support health literacies across equity groups, enhancing service delivery models for young people and their families, promoting the inclusion of diversity in educational settings, and supporting the meaningful inclusion of Indigenous perspectives and practices. Welcome to the show, Professor Jioji. Welcome, Nisa Bulavanaka and Talofa to Professor Jioji Ravulo. And you are this amazing, inspiring professor. And I actually came across your article in the Sydney Morning Herald, and it was basically introducing the first Pacific professor at the University of Sydney, or Sydney University. And so it's just a pleasure to have you. So a huge welcome. I am actually going to start with perhaps the villages of where you hail from, where Mum and Dad comes from.
Yeah, Nisan Bulavanaka, Talofa and G'day. Thank you so much, Marie, for having me on your podcast. My father comes from a village called Nayavuira in Nkorotumbo in Ra, in Fiji. And my mother is from Sydney, Australia. So they met when my father came to Australia in the mid-70s at the ubiquitous barbecue. And they then got together. And then I'm one of five, so I have a twin sister and then three younger siblings. And we grew up in southwestern Sydney. So we grew up in that area. Before I continue on, because of my protocols here in Australia, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands in which I am joining you on this podcast. So for me, I'm on the lands of the Dharawal people. I also acknowledge their elders past and present, but also acknowledge that the lands in which I'm joining the podcast are still considered stolen, as sovereignty was never ceded. And to further reiterate an ongoing commitment to work collaboratively with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. Now, why is that important? Because as Pacific Indigenous people ourselves, Marie, it's important that we understand space and place and how our own traditional ways of knowing and doing, being and becoming can be meaningfully included in our everyday conversations. And so I'm hoping that as part of our listeners' journey, that they also see their own Pacific Indigenous heritage as valuable and as important in their everyday realities.
Absolutely, which is why it's so important to have people that look like us, that acknowledge tangata whenua, just like here in Aotearoa, just like our Indigenous people in Australia. I mean, I grew up in Australia. I'm an Australian citizen in Newcastle, not far from Sydney, so I sort of get the vibe there, you know, the diaspora that's actually there, in the Pacific diaspora. So that's really great. I mean, your dad, when I read the article that your mum and dad, that your mum was a school teacher, am I right? And that dad was a factory worker. I'm wondering how influential, you know, was it your mum or was it both your parents that really pushed or encouraged you and your siblings to education?
It was both. It was both our parents. Because my dad only went up to year 8 in Fiji, and because my mother was an educator, she went to Teachers College and then was teaching across different areas of Western Sydney. Both of them had a real desire to see their own children engage in education. For my father, it was because he wanted his children to have a better life and his understanding of what that would look like because of what education can do. And because my mother, she saw the importance of education as an educator herself. She actually was a mother for most of her career. That also showed her dedication to being with us as children and also to guide us in those forms of formal and informal education. And my father was the same. He would sacrifice a lot of different things himself, both socially and financially, to support us. We grew up in public housing in Western Sydney. So we grew up in humble surroundings. But that was really formative in our understanding of the world and our place in the world. And if anything, continues to help me to understand the world off the back of that lived experience.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm wondering if we can step back a little bit, because I know that you're a professor now. And so looking at you, we see this, obviously someone of Pacifica, inspiring that you're definitely there representing all of our Pacifica, especially for young people growing up. But how did you actually get into academia? Has it always been sort of part of your vision? Did you have like a set of goals that, you're going to be a professor one day? And also I noticed that you're at the young age of 40 at the same time. So, do you mind sort of like backtracking a little bit for us?
Sure. So my immediate answer to did I aspire to become a professor? No, not at all. Not at all. I aspired to be a social worker. Growing up in diverse settings, I saw the realities of diversity and even being treated differently, and how that would have an impact on my own self-esteem. As a teenager, I was stereotyped and labelled, and I'd go into shopping centres. I'd be followed around by security. I would be labelled for being, big because I'm physically big. So people would assume that I was older or I was up to no good. Or because of my Pacific appearance, they just thought that that's just his capacity. That's all he's able to achieve. So off the back of that, I saw the potential to use education as a means for me to also be involved in those conversations. So I did my first degree in social work, and one of the reasons actually why I went into social work was because when I was 17, 18, before going to university, a report came out in New South Wales stating that Pacifica young people received double the sentencing of their white counterparts. So even though they had the same offences, the same offending history, they received the double severity of some form of court order or sentencing. So that got me really, obviously, very angry. And I thought, hey, how can I be involved in changing that narrative, changing and providing scope to have that conversation led elsewhere. So I started my first degree in social work. I actually didn't do that well in my final year. However, the university that I studied at, Western Sydney University, was doing a regional entrance test that enabled people that lived in Western Sydney to do a test that enabled me to get my grades up based on the university offer. So I got into uni via that pathway, and through that degree really learnt the realities of working effectively alongside people. After I finished that degree, I started working with young offenders out in southwest Sydney, and a majority of our caseload, the people that were working, were from Pacifica backgrounds and also from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander backgrounds. I wanted to learn more, Marie, so I went on and did my Masters in Education, and again, it was because I wanted to learn how education can be used to create change, and learning is part of that platform. But after I finished my Masters, I was like, I really want to learn how and why we're seeing an overrepresentation of our Pacific young people in prisons, in the youth justice space. So that's why I did my doctorate. It was not to become an academic, but because we needed empirical research. We needed studies and evidence that was not here in Australia. So that's why I did that. I did my doctorate full-time whilst working full-time. And when I finished, I continued to be working. I was now a manager in a youth homelessness service, still working with homeless young people and young people who offend. And then the University of Western Sydney knocked on my door and said, and this is now beginning of 2011, and they said, hey, do you want to become an academic? Do you want to be a lecturer? We've got a 12-month contract for you. And I said, no, thank you. I'm too busy keeping it real out on the streets of Western Sydney. But then I did some reflecting and some praying and thought, okay, let's give this a shot. So I stepped into that role for 12 months and pretty much then fell in love with the idea of being an academic in the sense of not because of the title or the status, but more so the opportunities to actually represent our communities in academic spaces. So from then, I then was able to successfully receive an ongoing role, because originally that was just a fixed-term role.
Yeah, 12 months.
Yeah, for 12 months, that's right. And they extended my contract for another 18 months. So we're now at the end of 2013. And then they then gave me a permanent role, which is great. And then I was promoted as a senior lecturer. And then I worked at that university for a while. And then I became an associate professor at the beginning of 2018, moved to the University of Wollongong. And then at the beginning of this year, I became a professor because it's ranked. It's actually academic levels are ranked. Then I became the first Professor of a Pacifica Heritage in Australia.
In Australia.
At the University of Sydney. Yeah, so that's the journey. And my vision still stays the same in the sense of wanting to represent diversity, our Pacifica people and our voices. I don't assume to represent our people per se, but to provide an opportunity and a platform for our people to be brought to the table. And that's what I'm still very much passionate about, Marie.
That is amazing. I mean, I need to just take a breath, Professor, because that is like incredible. And you know what? And you also mentioned that you were working full-time and studying for your PhD. So I mean, wow. Yeah. Did you sleep? Did you, was there a special, a formula? I mean, did you just, also I think you were young at the time, right? So were you married at the time, if you don't mind me asking?
No, I wasn't married. I was in my mid-20s.
See?
I was in my mid-20s.
Start young.
Yeah, I was still young. So I started my doctorate when I was around 25.
Okay.
And then I graduated, 25, 26, sorry. And then I graduated at the week of my 30th birthday. I graduated with my doctorate. Yeah.
That's impressive. Okay, so there's some tips there. Start young if you can, because you've just got this momentum going.
I think it's also passion, Marie. I think it's one of the things I encourage people to look to is look to areas of passion, and that's what actually makes a big difference. When you choose to study a particular area at a polytech or a college or at uni, it makes a big difference in your ability to actually progress in your course. High school is fun. We engage in the various subjects, but sometimes we struggle, right? Because we're forced to choose those subjects. But when you have the ability to choose the area that you'd like to study, a passion area, it can make all the difference to get you through your course and into the field that you would like to be involved in.
Yeah, absolutely. Now let's talk about the elephant in the room. Probably not an elephant because it's already out there, but what I mean is the unfortunate experiences of racism that our Pacific people encounter. I mean, I remember I grew up and I went to school there and it was just horrifying. Every day, a whole class would send me, basically a young person, messages that you don't belong here. And I remember thinking back and I'm thinking, I'm just going to keep coming into this class. I have every right to be here, to come into this class and sit down and get an education. But could you perhaps share a little bit about some of the experiences that sometimes we do get, whether it's unconscious bias or some racism that overt, that I'm sure that we could share loads of experiences from?
Yeah, racism is real. Racism is real. And it can be, as you said, an unconscious bias that someone might have, and or it could be blatant. Some of the experiences I've had over the years is related to my hair and comments that people have made about my hair. For listeners,
I love your hair.
Thanks, Marie.
Love it. You're rocking it. Yeah.
Oh, thank you, Marie. But I've had comments from generally, again, non-Pacific people who will say things like, "Oh, when I saw your hair, I thought you'd, stuck your finger and got electrocuted, and now your hair's like it is," or like those blatant sort of comments, and you just think, "Wow, that's really unhelpful." And then just sort of people even coming up wanting to touch my hair.
Oh no, really?
Like, I don't, and yes, I get that quite a bit actually. And we know as Pacific people, this is for Fijians, our hair is our mana. This is where we hold our knowledge and our wisdom and our power. And,
that's right.
And, to touch someone's hair is so not
wrong. Yeah.
It's not a thing you should be doing. So I think physically, because we look different, we're almost like, seen as the other. We're almost like, there's almost like we're seen as exotic, and we're seen as this sort of thing that people can sort of play with. And so that's the thing that I think we are challenged by in places like Australia and Aotearoa, is this idea of how do we continuously show that we do have beyond our appearance? This is about challenging those stereotypes. And for me, education has been a way to do that we are capable beyond what people perceive us to be. And so for me, part of that conversation is to get more of us as Pacific people overrepresented in those educational spaces and overrepresented in other areas where you don't see Pacific people. Because traditionally here in Australia, we're overrepresented in the legal system, and we're overrepresented in the health system with non-communicable diseases like diabetes and heart disease and issues with sleep apnea. And that's how people perceive us. Wider society sees us in these overrepresented areas. They may also just see us as being able just to do the physical stuff with sport or the performing arts. Don't get me wrong, sport and performing arts, I'm involved in working with the National Rugby League. I come from a performing arts background. They're so important for us to go into, and that does make up our cultural practices. It's also important, though, that we also see ourselves beyond just some of those broader areas that people may just see us within. So I'm seeing more Pacific athletes go into further education and training to support their careers beyond an NRL career, or mixing it up with other areas to ensure that they can support their communities and family, of course. So I think that's how we try and get around some of those labels and stereotypes.
Right. Could you just perhaps share, as young people these days, I mean, obviously with the spread of social media and the marketing and, look at me on Instagram and I want a life like that, I want to look like that, I want to all sorts of, and their mental health. What are some of the challenges that you're seeing on the ground when you were a youth leader? Because I know that you're part of the community. What are some of the key challenges or things that they're starting to overcome?
Yeah, a lot of it's to do with space and place and having a sense of connection and identity. I'm still doing clinical work outside of my academic role. So I'm still doing counselling work, Marie.
Okay.
And working with different young people across the community.
Yeah.
And what I find is this sense of belonging and sense of connection. And a lot of, I think because we grow up in sort of this experience of having our lived Pacific culture at home and then going out into Western societies in New Zealand and Australia, what I find with our young people is balancing this mixed identity of knowing both their Pacific identity whilst also keeping up with Western expectations. And sometimes we think you have to do one or the other. My encouragement is that we can actually, I believe, do both. That we can be proudly Pacific, but we can also learn how to interact and engage with the Western environments that we surround ourselves in, But he's saying this is the other challenge as well, and this is my ongoing daily challenge. We need Western society to also ensure that their structures and systems and what they do is also influenced by diversity. So I'll give you an example. So part of my broader work is to ensure that education systems like local schools are meaningfully including Pacific ways of knowing and doing, being and becoming, so how we understand the world around us in the way in which they create learning spaces to ensure that our perspectives are also part of the teaching and teaching practices. Same sort of thing with the legal system, also encouraging the legal system to understand how to better work with us, specific people, but also the health system. I've been involved in some vaccination campaigns here in New South Wales and encouraging our Department of Health to be better when it comes to nuancing their health messages for Pacific people.
Right.
So, it's very much around still be proud to be Pacific, learn how to engage in those Western contexts, but also teach the Western context to also work alongside us.
Yeah, how is that? We could spend a lot of time on that particular the system, educational system. Has that started to change or shift? What are your thoughts?
It is, I think, in areas of Greater Western Sydney where there is a large proportion of Pacifica people, alongside other areas of Australia on the east coast of Australia, including South Brisbane and areas of Melbourne in Victoria. There is an evolution, and I think part of that evolution of change is because we're seeing more of us as Pacific people in those conversations.
Great.
And the reason why you're seeing more of us in those conversations is because we are going into education and training areas that enables us to be included in those conversations.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Yeah, that's great. Could you perhaps share how important it is for you to, because I know growing up in Australia, it was actually very traumatic, especially I think back in the day when church played a really huge role, where the parents go and the kids go. That was, I'm not saying that that's what it is now, but a sense of hub, like you mentioned, is that our young people feeling that they are connecting, that they have that connection. Because some of the things that I'm also doing some research around New Zealand-born Samoans and how they view culture, language, and feeling like, can they actually do it all? Like when they see you and when they go home, mum and dad want to serve and go to church and do community and all that. And then and sometimes on the grassroots, when we talk to teachers at school, that some of our kids turn up really tired because a lot of the time that they're spending almost 80-90% of their time in community or church, and then when they go to school on Monday, they haven't even had any time to do their homework. What would you say about I know that we're trying to balance everything, but I'm thinking, if I want to be a professor, if I want to be a PhD and I'm doing study, that's a lot of commitment for a young person. But then at the same time, I feel like, okay, I have to also be here in my culture, and sometimes church does take up a lot of time. There's a lot of, there's youth groups, and then we've got practices. Then we go sometimes half the day on Sunday, and by the time the kids can come back, it's back to school on Monday. Yeah. Well, what are your thoughts?
That is a common experience, yes. One of the things that I've been doing over the many years now is to share a broader conversation with the community around how we can understand those particular expectations. And for me, it's what I call a whole of family, whole of community response. So it's this idea of working with individual Pacific young people to understand the importance of education, but we also need to encourage and educate our parents to see the importance and role of education, and then we can then create more of a community understanding. So it's almost working at the different levels as it means to create a shared, a whole of family, a whole of community understanding. Yeah. So that's been part of my broader passion is how can we bring everyone to the conversation? I think in Western societies, we very much just focus on the individual and educating the individual to be empowered. But in our collectivist cultures that we see in the Pacific, it's very much about that whole of family approach. So I think this is where Western societies need to be better as well in regards to when they are, encouraging individual Pacific young people to engage in their learning. Schools need to also engage the parents proactively and productively to ensure that both are keeping up. But the schools also need to ensure that their approaches are inclusive of the different learning styles that we as Pacific people may engage in. So it's about being able to work together to ensure that those particular key messages are understood by more than just the individual.
Yeah, absolutely. And especially if your parents they've never been in academia, they've actually never experienced, the pressure so it's very foreign to them perhaps, and so there's the bit of a miscommunication with the young person or their son or daughter. Yeah, so that is brilliant. That is a really great sort of bridging that gap, isn't it?
Very much so. And I've been involved in initiatives where we were supporting an initiative called Pacifica Achievement to Higher Education, which is about to celebrate its 10th year at Western Sydney University. And when we initiated that initiative back in the day, part of our program was to run events specifically for family members. It was called Bring the Family to Uni. And it was to engage, because we heard from our students that they would go home after uni and their family members wouldn't really understand because they were first in their family to go to uni. And they were not understanding the expectations of being at a university level. So we'd run events every 3 months called Bring the Family to Uni to encourage university students and their parents, their uncles, their aunties, their brothers, their sisters, their cousins to come. And when we ran our first event back in 2012, I initially thought that 30 people would attend. We had 150 people attend the events. And that showed a couple of things. It showed that there was an interest, but then there was also a need around the idea of supporting our Pacifica young people through tertiary education, and also encouraging our whole families to learn, our whole communities to learn about those realities.
I just love the work that you're doing, Professor Jioji. I think there's the grassroots, it's the community, it's the whole inga o whānau, it's the whole, mum and dad, grandpa, grandma. It's really bringing that collective support, isn't it, to our young people. And especially if we want, like you say, if we want to actually not be a statistic or not actually be, what police or as you've experienced along the way, not to overrepresent in the good things rather than, in our prisons and in the courts and also in our health. And I mean, it's very similar. I'm not saying that, the diaspora of Pacifica is the same, but it seems like it's very similar thread here in New Zealand, which is very similar to what perhaps is happening in Sydney, in Australia.
Yeah, I agree. There are similarities. And I think one of the similarities is because of that Western context in which we operate, that we're in a society that is very much individually focused, a Western perspective, and this idea that wealth or accumulation of wealth is what is good and best for us. Whereas for Pacific people, we're around, the well-being is a shared approach. The Solomaki in Fijian is this, for us Samoa, this idea that my well-being is your well-being. It's a holistic approach. And my wealth is my family and my community, as opposed to money and the acquisition of goods. Yeah. So, compare and contrast. And a lot of the time it's a matter of also understanding those differences and then learning how we can navigate those differences.
Yeah, that's great. Professor Jioji, what would you say to young people that have actually perhaps chosen the Western way simply because, one, they've had, not a good experience or struggling to actually have that balance, and on another hand is that maybe sometimes, when they try to actually participate or they try to speak their mum and dad's language because, even though they are from, Pacific descent, that they are born outside of the islands, what would you say to them that they're like, you know what, it's not for me, I'll rather assimilate because I need to actually drop the language and speak English and then, climb that corporate ladder or go as fast as I can and be like my mates?
I would encourage our Pacific young people to be you, which will include your Pacific heritage. I've seen this a lot, actually. I'll see young people who then will come into adulthood where they've been brought up, even from being told by both their parents, don't go hang out with the Pacific young people because they'll distract you from engaging in further education, or they'll be a bad influence, like from their own Pacific parents. And I've heard that time and time again. But what I've found is, and this is just me, real talk.
Yeah, real talk.
Your Pacific identity will follow you. It will follow you, and it's inextricably connected to you. So I would encourage our Pacific young people to lean into that and to embrace their diversity, to embrace their differences, because it's actually a strength. Your Pacific identity can be utilised as a strength.
It is.
Your ability to
like it how you said that. Yeah, absolutely is a strength. What would you say to your younger self now that you are a professor, now that you're 40? Your mum and dad instilled this incredible. That your mum, what I love about what you're saying about your mum is that she didn't pursue her teaching, but she stayed home to look after. That's very rare. What would you say to your younger self? That some of the things that you learned now that are timeless treasures and things that you've learned along the way that will be that only in hindsight that you'll be able to pick up?
I would say to my younger self, keep going. And also be you. Yeah. One of the things I've learned coming into this new role at the University of Sydney, and I was actually saying this to my boss recently, is when I first started in March, I thought to myself, I need to be, the best I can. And so I was looking at the previous professors that were in this role that I'm in as chair of the department. So apart from being a professor, I also am the chair of the Social Work and Policy Studies program and the broader department with a team of staff. And I would look to other people to go, okay, how do I do this based on what that looks like over there? But I was saying to my boss the other day that 7 months in, I've learned that it's not about looking to other people. Yes, learn from other people, get mentors and be mentored and see others as an example. But be yourself, be you. And that's why you were employed into the role. And that's why you've been chosen to be in that role. So that's something that I would continue to encourage myself and my younger self, is just to be me.
Great, I love it.
That is what can make a difference.
Yeah,
and that's
absolutely.
one of the key things that I have now also started to continue to say to people is you can make a difference through your difference.
Yes, that is so tweetable. That is so, I'll highlight that in the interview. Yes. Can you repeat that again? That was good.
Yeah. You can make a difference through your difference.
Yes, absolutely. Now I know that you're a creative person as well, so you've got a lot of hats going on here. What's on the playlist for Professor Jioji? What's on the playlist at the moment? Is it what type of vibe is happening on your Spotify list before we go?
Yeah. I'm all about neo soul. So I love me some Pacific reggae. I love Pacific reggae. Just love it. I love what that brings and the voice that brings to our community and to the spaces in which we traverse. I'm into neo soul, so some of those sort of slow jams and also just those beats. So I'm actually on YouTube a lot, just looking at different film clips from different neo soul artists. But yeah, I love that sort of range of music. I love that question because it always throws me. I go, okay, what am I listening to at the moment? But yeah, music has played an important part. Listen to gospel music as well, and I think as Pacifica people, music is also our playlist. We do have a lot of connecting points to music. It does provide me with a lot of source of encouragement and joy. I listen to a lot of music that might have a social consciousness to it.
Nice.
As well. I started to get into some drill rap, and that's because I've started to look at, as actually part of a project that I'm working on with 1-4. You may have heard of the drill rap group 1-4 from Western Sydney. We're looking at how that type of music does provide a space for Pacific voices to be heard. It is controversial, though, because it has been mobilised and criminalised. It's been mobilised to be criminalised here in Australia, which is problematic, and that's another conversation for another time, I'm sure.
There's another one, yeah, definitely.
But what I'm basically trying to say is that music has always been a mobile for our voices.
Yes.
And I think it's important that we continue to lean into that too.
Yeah, absolutely. Last question, because we could go on. I mean, there's so many themes coming out on our Talanoa today. Last question, what are you most looking forward to in the next 5-10 years?
Wow, that's a great question. You're asking all the great questions, Marie. What am I looking forward to?
I mean, you're 40. I mean, let's put it into perspective. 30, like earlier this year, and correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, you were leading. You weren't a professor, but you were a chair, right?
Yeah, I'm a chair now. In my professor role. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. And so you're 40, and you've just done so much. So I'm just thinking, what is that level up? Because I need to lie down after this. I need to lie down after this interview.
I think what I would like to do in the next 5 to 10 years is to continue to be true to self, to be me, and to continue to follow my passions, which is people and places, and how we continue as Pacific people to be involved in these spaces and places. So in 5 to 10 years, let's talk again, Marie, and see if I've been able to maintain that passion for places and spaces. But yeah, I think that's what I see. I want to continue to remain true to my what drives me, and it really is. It's about seeing diversity play out in different areas of society, different areas of life, and I'm very passionate about ensuring that we are part of that conversation. Yeah.
Well, Professor Jioji, thank you so much. Thank you for your passion. Thank you for your advice and your life, and the values and your I mean, just your ancestral belonging and spirit that really pours out of your passion. And the advice, I mean, it's just amazing. It's really inspiring to not only myself, but to read that article. And I think there's so many things that you just overcome, and you've just really slayed it. That you've just had this great, and I love you rocking yourself, and be you, and just rocking your hairstyle and everything about you. So keep up the amazing work. We don't know whether we're ever going to actually see Australia anytime soon, but I would love to actually come over and see some of the programs that you've actually got going in Sydney. So thank you so much, Whaafitai Lava. Professor, keep shining, keep being you. You're just amazing. Thank you. Thank you for listening to PEP Talk, brought to you by Pacific Enterprise People. I've been your host, Marie Young, and you can reach me through our website, www.pacificenterprisepeople.com. We look forward to sharing more stories of Pacific enterprising people. If you would like to share your story, send me an email, marie@pacificenterprisepeople.com. PEP Talk is also available on Spotify, Apple Podcast, and YouTube. Thank you for subscribing, liking, and sharing. This is Marie Young. Until next time, keep shining.